If you had told me 16 months ago that I would be eating grits every morning for breakfast, I would have laughed. I'm a guy who grew up thinking that if there wasn't at least a certain amount of cholesterol or sugar, it wasn't breakfast. If you had told me 16 months ago that I would have spent a year and a half in shorts and sandals, and that it would provoke an existential crisis when I had to consider wearing long pants and shoes, I would have laughed. I'm a guy who wore business casual to seminary and wondered about the professionalism of those students half my age who wore shorts and sandals to class. If you had told me 16 months ago that I would be excited about hauling myself out of bed early on a Sunday morning to go to church and see everyone, I would have said, "I know, right? It's great!" I'm the guy that likes coming to church. What can I say? It's not news to you that it's been an unusual and difficult year and a half. Throughout this time, the ministers and staff have worked hard to determine what would be most useful to you during this time. Having not lived through a pandemic before, and certainly not having worked at a church during one, we made some educated guesses, had some minor missteps, and had some success. We have presented programs and groups to keep you connected, and worship services with themes and messages to not only keep you connected, but grounded through each unpredictable stage of what was happening next. Today, we are preparing to gather again in person next week. And not coincidentally, our theme this month is Gather the Spirit. I realized as I was gathering my thoughts and preparing my sermon that many of the things I wanted to talk about this morning, I've already talked about recently. That's because we're about to be able to actually do some of the things that I've been describing lately as meaningful and important in our lives. But now we're thinking less about how to deal with not having them and more about what it will look like when we have them again. Now, the last time I preached, I talked about the origin of the song, "Gathered Here in the Mystery of this hour." People responded so warmly to hearing this story of gathering, popular in UU circles, and so many of us are so eager to see one another again in person. Reverend Colin and I decided to use other UU songs about gathering together in love and community to amplify our theme of Gather the Spirit. And today I'll talk about the hymn, "We Laugh, We Cry." This song is notable among our hymns for several reasons. Like some, it doesn't feature lyrics written 100 years ago set to music from 200 years ago. Shelley Jackson Denham, who wrote both the music and lyrics, was music director for the Heritage Unitarian Universalist Church in Cincinnati for several years in the late 1980s. She wrote 5 songs in our great hymnal, Singing the Living Tradition, including number 86, "Blessed Spirit of My Life," and of course, number 354, "We Laugh, We Cry." While most hymns go on for 1, maybe 2 pages in the hymnal, this one goes on for a full 3 pages, which means that if the accompanist is listless that morning, you can duck out to Channing Hall, have coffee, and be back before it's finished. But before I could even suggest it, Mark wisely suggested we split the lengthy tune into 2 parts, before and after the hymn. What I asked him to do was to sing the middle 2 verses first and finish with the first and fourth. And there's a reason for that. The first and last verses address how we live in this world. The first verse is about belonging, close friends, and sharing. Very appropriate for this month's theme of gathering together in community. The fourth describes our search for answers, making sense of our lives, and coming together to make the world a better place. As Unitarian Universalists, we do come together to share and support one another in our quest to make sense of our lives, to find a spiritual path that gives depth and meaning to us personally. Many others go to church and hear why a predetermined spiritual path must work for them, but we don't do that. We recognize that we're all different and that wisdom can be found in many places. We recognize it is important to deepen our spiritual lives, but don't dictate how to do that. As television host and political commentator Melissa Harris Perry wrote in her foreword to the latest edition of the Unitarian Universalist Pocket Guide, Unitarian Universalism is not attached to particular beliefs. Rather, it is committed to specific work, striking a balance between openness to differing viewpoints on the one hand and fierce advocacy of shared ethical claims on the other. This pocket guide hints at our rich, complex, imperfect, and collective struggles to balance these goals while building diverse and supportive communities. Diverse and supportive communities. Denham's first verse ends by pointing out, we need to feel there's something here to which we can belong. We need to feel the freedom just to have some time alone, but most of all, we need close friends we can call our very own. In my sermon 2 weeks ago, I said, we all need a place where we find our tribe, our people. Close friends we can call our very own. And I talked about how many have found them in our UU churches. I quoted the teacher and activist Starhawk, who wrote, community. Somewhere there are people to whom we can speak with passion without having the words catch in our throats. Somewhere a circle of hands will open to receive us. Eyes will light up as we enter. Or, as RuPaul put it more concisely, you have to find your tribe. While the first and last verses of We Laugh, We Cry address how we live in this world, the topics of the second and third are bookends of our lives. The second verse, we sing about a child being born and the wonder of youth. The third speaks to death and the memories we leave behind. I rather like that she put those two in the middle and used the two about living, loving, and belonging, and questioning, seeking, and peace to bookend those. What we do while we are living, after all, are more important. The poem that Connie read earlier, titled The Dash, has become a popular reading at funerals and memorial services. Being in a profession that attends more than my fair share of memorial services, I've heard it once too often and, to be honest, became tired of it. Plus it rhymes, which isn't my favorite kind of poem, unless it's set to music. But I unenthusiastically used the poem in a sermon a couple of years ago, and so many people told me how much they enjoyed it. They hadn't heard it before, and apparently like poems that rhyme. So, since then, I've been less reluctant to share it. It describes how on a person's tombstone, in between the year someone is born and the year they pass away, is a dash. The poem tells us it is not those specific dates that are listed, the beginning and ending, but what happens in our lives during the dash that really matters. It's not that Shelley Jackson Denham was born in 1950 and died in 2013. It's the wonderful music she left us during her life. The song We Laugh, We Cry seems to turn it inside out by putting the living, the dash, in the first and last verses, and the dates, being born and dying, in the middle. Now, of course, some births and deaths are notable. Louise Brown, the first test tube baby, was born in 1978. And Dolly, called the world's most famous sheep, was the first mammal successfully cloned. The episode of I Love Lucy that aired on the evening of January 19th, 1953, with a huge, for the time, 44 million viewers watching, saw Lucy Ricardo give birth to little Ricky, while in real life, on the same day, Lucille Ball delivered Desi Arnaz Jr. The birth made the first cover of the issue of TV Guide. The world was in love with Princess Diana. So when the Princess of Wales gave birth to William, a future King of England, many people across the former British Empire and the United States were captivated. Of course, many more were both captivated and devastated when Diana died. Her acts of charity, the good she did while alive, is what made the death both notable and shattering. Then there are those people whose lives were notable, and so people noticed when they died, but then the death led to unexpected events bigger than the person themselves. I immediately think of the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian Ferdinand. His killing led to the July Crisis, a series of escalations among the major powers of Europe in 1914, which led to the outbreak of World War I. Now, there's an enduring theory, apparently more popular than verifiable, that I've heard for years. It's that the heightened emotions over Judy Garland's funeral in June of 1960 contributed in a significant way to the historic outcry and rebellion at the Stonewall Inn early the next morning in Greenwich Village. When trans activist Sylvia Rivera heard about the funeral, she became hysterical, but a friend begged her to meet at the Stonewall Inn. Now, there were so many contributing factors to cause those there to fight back that night. We may never know if Judy Garland's death was the straw that broke the unicorn's back. But for mere mortals like me and you, the differences we make will be in the dash, in the first and fourth verses. How we spend our lives, the lives we touch, the love we give. If our death does change the world, we will never know. Now, it's not just tombstones that seem to focus on the beginning and ending instead of what happens in between. Those of you who have heard me before may have picked up on the fact that I grew up going to a Methodist church in Kentucky. Each Sunday, we would dutifully recite the Apostles' Creed. Some of you who grew up in traditionally Christian churches may have had a similar experience. I remember having it memorized before I understood what all the words meant. From thence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead. Seemed to make Jesus into an official at a macabre foot race to me as a 6-year-old. Years later in seminary, I realized something interesting about the Apostles' Creed. It totally skips the amazing life of compassion and teachings of Jesus. The part we use tend to find most fascinating. It goes directly from born of the Virgin Mary to suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. The Apostles' Creed focuses on the birth and death, Christmas and Good Friday, verses 2 and 3, while we, as you use, focus on what happened between those two events, the dash, the first and last verses, and what we can learn from the life and teachings of perhaps the one person who may have gotten how to live right. Now, I don't know that I will ever be accused of getting how to live right in an exemplary fashion. It's clear to me that Jesus was more successful at navigating his struggles than I, and his birth, dash, and death will certainly be more influential than mine. But even he needed his tribe, his group of like-minded folks to support him, bounce ideas off of, eat supper with. Historic suppers that would be recreated every week in churches around the world. Some have theorized Jesus' greatest miracle was having 12 close friends in his 30s. It's so good to have people here. I'm getting reactions. This warms my heart so much. When I was a kid, I remember a relative who didn't attend church but enjoyed fishing ask, well, can't I worship God and be spiritual out in nature? I remember thinking, sure, but do you? I was pretty sure they didn't. I could be rather judgmental as a child. But they were ignoring a vital part of gathering together in a faith community. We gather together because we need one another. I talked earlier about finding our tribe. As author Scott Stabile wrote in the excerpt Reverend Colin read, find people who love you for real and to accept you for real, just as you are. They're out there, these people. Your tribe is waiting for you. Don't stop searching until you find them. Jesus needed his group of like-minded folks to bounce ideas off of. In the 4th verse, Shelley Jackson Denham writes, we come together here to make sense of what we find. I often say we come together when we need help looking for answers to the big questions in life. I quoted earlier from the latest edition of the Unitarian Universalist Pocket Guide. In it, friend of our congregation, Aisha Hauser, wrote, Unitarian Universalists are uniquely positioned to create atmospheres where people can learn from each other about the most difficult of topics. I love this faith. Everyone should have a place that affirms their being, that declares they are loved in the fullness of who they are. The way I explain Unitarian Universalism to folks is, we all came from one source and we are loved. If anyone asks me to elaborate, I talk about my interfaith family and our desire to be part of a pluralistic community whose members work toward a society that lives out justice and equity in all forms. I hope you too have found your tribe, your home, and friendship here. I hope that after 16 months, you too are excited about hauling yourself out of bed early on Sunday morning and coming to church and seeing everyone. Because next week, we will meet again in person, and I can't all say, I know, it's great, right? Amen.